Norwich is a really lovely city in Norfolk, and one which I would strongly recommend people to visit once the current situation is over. It is also home, from a networks point of view, to a rather quirky 5G deployment from O2 and their vendor Nokia, which will be the focus of today's video. Our first site is located in the northwest of the city, near a golf course, and you can see that it is rather compact and unobtrusive. And this is largely thanks to the Commscope antennas that are deployed here, which feature a behemoth number of ports supporting the full 2G to 5G portfolio for host operator O2, as well as share of Vodafone, including higher order MIMO capability for a selection of the bands. Specifically, these antennas carry the 88R 5G for O2 off Nokia Airscale AZQL remote radios, so that's 8 ports plus calibration. Then there is 88R 2300 MHz from AZNC Airscale remote radios, which also takes another 8 ports plus calibration. And then there is the remaining FDD technologies, 2G to 4G, which are carried using 4 low band red ports and 4 high band yellow ports. The Airscale remote radios are quite visible on this site. Specifically from this view, you can see one AZQL in the middle and then 2 AZNCs on either side of it, and on the other side of this mast there is another remote radio rack which has 2 AZQLs and 1 AZNC, so that there are 3 of each to serve 3 sectors on this mast. The remaining bands and technologies are all carried through conventional Nokia radios in the equipment cabin, which unfortunately were not visible. This site does not have 2600 MHz for Vodafone, but that's pretty reasonable given its suburban location. But the 5G performance from O2 was very respectable, doing between about 300 and 350 megabits per second with 4-layer operation and 256 QAM modulation. This is potentially limited by the backhaul on this site, which is most likely to be 1 gig MES. Our first slightly bizarre site is this one located at another industrial estate. Now, this site from a radio point of view is very much the same, if not identical, to the last site, using AZNCs for 2300 MHz and AZQLs for 3500 MHz. The antenna layout is, however, rather different, with Huawei ATD antennas used for carrying the 2300 MHz 88R off the AZNCs and the 3500 MHz 5G off the AZQLs, with the remaining technologies and bands being carried on Huawei AQU antennas, which have the 4 low band ports and the 4 high band ports. The odd thing with this site was quite simply that it was not actually radiating 2300 MHz for some reason, but the 5G was live, doing between about 300 to 350 megabits per second. So it's really quite bizarre that they enabled 5G on this, but they did not enable 2300 MHz despite the equipment being there, which is really quite strange. This site also doesn't have 2600 MHz for Vodafone, owing most likely to its location quite suburbanly. It's now time for the really quite quirky sites, which are located near the city centre. The first site is a single antenna per sector configuration using Huawei AHP 4518R7 antennas. Now, in terms of overall port layout, these are quite similar to the first site that we saw in terms of having the capability for 88R2300, 88R3500, and then the full range of 2G to 4G FDD capability as well. However, these antennas do this in a very different way, and what's actually deployed on them is also very different. So these AHPs have cluster ports for the 2300 and 3500 MHz range, so 2 cluster ports for each range. There are also 4 red low band ports and 6 yellow high band ports. However, the full capability of this antenna is not realised by O2 in this deployment. While the cluster ports can support 88R for 2300 MHz and 3500 MHz, only 44R is deployed across both of these frequencies. The 44R 2300 MHz coming off FZNJ remote radios, and the 44R 3500 MHz coming off the AZQL radios we've seen before, albeit with half of the RF ports not being used. Perhaps this is because when Vodafone requests to have 5G on this site, separate AZQL remote radios will be installed to support Vodafone's 5G, with each operator having separate remote radios for 5G, much as has been seen on the O2 Ericsson sites that are featured in a previous video. The justification for 44R 2300 MHz might simply just be due to the deployment time when actually 44R was more common on that band. From an FDD point of view, the red ports, low band ports, are used very much as normal, and 4 of the yellow high band ports are used kind of like in the previous installations. However, these yellow ports in this case are connected up to combiners because this mast has 2600 MHz for Vodafone using 44R FRHGs, which is therefore then diplex alongside the 1800 and 2100 and then 2100 MHz as per the schematic. Despite being only 44R 5G, performance was fairly reasonable, with the site supporting 4 layers contemporaneously and 256 QAM again for the typical kind of speeds. However, the coverage will likely be extremely limited because of the 44R MIMO capability. The final site is something of a hybrid of MAST 2 and MAST 3 that we've seen. It's like MAST 2 in that it has 2 antennas per sector, and actually port wise they're the same as well. So we've got a 8 port, which is a Huawei AQU again, and then for the second antenna we've got, in this case, a Commscope T4S4-90A-R2, which has the 8 ports plus calibration for 2300 and the 8 ports plus calibration for the 3500 MHz. Like site 3, this site has 2600 MHz 4G for Vodafone off FRHGs, which is diplexed much like in the previous site, and also it is 44R for 2300 MHz off SZNJs, and also 44R for 3500 MHz 5G off the AZQLs, once again only using half of their RF ports. So it's really quite a bizarre site, and 5G performance off this one was quite poor, with it maxing out at 2 layers and around about 200 megabits per second. As this site is quite urban, I would suggest that the 44R 5G deployment is possibly for that future Vodafone deployment capability. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through of performance at this quirky selection of deployment architecture O2 Nokia 5G sites. I hope you've enjoyed it, and stay safe and follow public health guidance if you are going out and about.